Welcome to ONLit's video series on data-informed systems. In this series, you will learn more about the different assessments we use to collect data and information about students' reading proficiency and development. As well, we will consider how each of these different types of assessments fit into a comprehensive assessment system that will inform the reading health of not only individual students, but also at a school and board level. Lastly, we will look at which assessments to use with which students and how often, so that we are collecting valuable data for the students we need to while prioritizing instructional time. In this session, we will discuss what is meant by MTSS, or multi-tiered system of support. This video will focus on screening measures. First, we will highlight the difference between universal screeners and benchmark assessments. Then we will look at what universal screeners are, which students we administer them with, what information is provided, and how often we should collect this data. Lastly, I will highlight some things you might consider if you are planning to implement universal screening measures, or if you have already incorporated these measures into your assessment system. To begin, it is important that we come to this work with individual students in mind. Often when we consider assessments and data, we see numbers that may be color-coded. We look at data in relation to above, at, below, or well below expected criteria. But this data reflects the reading development of an individual student, a child. Learning to read is not a privilege, it is a human right. As teachers, we have this incredible responsibility to ensure that the decisions we make in what we teach, how we teach it, and how we know students are developing as readers will provide equitable access to this human right for every student. While learning to read is not a privilege, teaching children to read certainly is. What greater impact can a teacher have in a child's life? In whatever role you have, whether it is at the board, school, or classroom levels, decisions are going to be made that will influence how reading instruction is approached and how supports are put in place to ensure that all students are provided what they need in order to develop as readers. Here's a quote from Next Steps in Literacy Instruction. This is an excellent book that connects assessment to instruction. It says, as problem solvers, teachers know that the solutions to many of their students' struggles with learning to read are found in data gathered through three kinds of assessment: screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring. It positions teachers as problem solvers and as being active in using various types of assessments to think more deeply and critically about reading behaviors. That these assessments can be used to know and learn more about students as readers and are not just administered and reported to the school or board because that is what is being asked of them. What becomes important is that the culture of collecting reading data is to inform and respond, that it is used to make informed decisions for individual students, as well as what supports may be needed at the school and board levels. Let's begin with developing an understanding of how these types of assessments fit into a multi-tiered system of support. You'll often see a triangle graphic used when referring to MTSS. The triangle symbolizes the tiered delivery model of flexible, additive layers of support. All students in an MTSS receive research-backed, differentiated core instruction. The goal of this instruction is to act as primary prevention, providing low-cost instruction to reduce student risk as much as possible. Strong Tier 1 instruction is the backbone of a multi-tiered system of supports. The implementation of an assessment system and data-based decision-making are components of a more comprehensive system. And it is when all of these components are working together that we have an understanding of students as readers, their individual needs. We have interventions in place to address them, and a means of continually evaluating instructional programs, resources, and decisions to ensure responsiveness. It is important to note that visual representations of this model often have percentages associated with them. These percentages stated here refer to the number of students reaching benchmark with these supports, not just the number of students we would expect to develop reading proficiency. We don't expect 80% of students to become proficient readers. We expect 100% of students to become proficient readers. However, it may be that about 80% of students will achieve that through evidence-aligned classroom instruction, but that 15% of students will achieve that with the additional support, and another 5% of students will require more intensive, individualized support to reach that level of proficiency. So we give all students the rigorous instruction we can through this model to make that happen. It is important that we are purposeful with how we are collecting data, how we are analyzing data, and how we're using it to inform instruction. We use a process called the outcomes-driven model. The actions and decisions educators make are driven by measuring student outcomes and using them to refine plans and instruction. Remember, we want a preventative system. Our first step is to identify students at risk. This is where we identify students who will benefit from more intensified instruction to support their reading development. When we have identified these students, we need to know their individual needs. What are the skills they have and which skills are needed and can be targeted through instruction? Then we plan and implement instruction. This is where we consider small groupings, who might deliver the instruction, in what setting, what are the instructional materials that will be used, the duration of the targeted instruction, like how many weeks, how often, is it daily, and for how long, is it 10 minutes per day? Lastly, it is important to ensure that students are responding to the instruction. We want to evaluate the plan intermittently so we know the instruction is working. If the student is not making expected progress or has plateaued, changes can be made to the instructional plan. Different assessment tools are used in each stage of this model. To screen all students, we use a universal screener. This will tell us who is at risk, but it will not provide the discrete details on which skills students have and which they need for instruction. For that, we administer various diagnostic assessments. When students are receiving intensified instructional supports, we can use progress monitoring assessments to track how well they are responding to the instruction. In this session, we will focus on learning more about universal screeners. Let's consider the types of reading assessments we may have been using in the past and how those differ from universal screening measures. Benchmark assessments are a form of assessment called an informal reading inventory. A misconception with schools may be that we are already or have been universally screening students because we've been using these benchmark assessments with all students, perhaps multiple times per year. Most commonly used assessments in schools are these benchmark assessments. These are used to assign an independent and instructional reading level to students reflected by a letter or number. Examples of benchmark assessments are Fontes and Pinnell, DRA, or PM benchmarks, and they are often administered between 1 to 3 times per year. There are concerns with these types of assessments. Remember that universal screeners are the initial step to identify which students may be at risk for reading difficulties. To identify risk, we want to provide all students with the same opportunity without inadvertently advantaging some students over others, which is why we want to standardize the assessment and the process. The benchmark assessments that have been popularized and used in most boards are not standardized. The leveled gradient is arbitrary, and research has demonstrated that these assessments lack reliability and validity, which are two important aspects related to assessments that are necessary when we are using these to identify students' reading proficiency. It is important that the assessment measures being used measure what we are expecting them to measure and what they are intended to measure, and that the data provided are reliable. Benchmark assessments assign an instructional or independent reading level. When using these assessments, we consider this level in an arbitrary gradient that aligned a letter or number to grade level expectations at various points throughout the year. For example, it may have been that students should be reading at a level C by mid-grade 1. Progression through the levels was how we perceived reading development. Let's compare this to a universal screener. These measures illustrate student performance relative to the long-term goal. So we aren't looking at a level or even the content or skills the students are learning currently. We are considering their performance relative to the general outcome or performance desired at the end of the year. So in the middle of grade 1, I've taught specific phonics patterns and a number of high-frequency words. And for instructional purposes, my students are reading decodable texts that reflect the patterns I have taught and am currently teaching, so they have opportunities to practice and develop mastery of those skills for storage in their brains that will support automatic retrieval. However, a universal screening measure I will use in the middle of the year reflects the general outcome or end of grade level text that will include words and letter patterns I may not have explicitly taught yet. I'm using the universal screener to measure a student's reading development relative to grade level, not on the mastery of skills that I have taught. For that, I would use a different assessment tool. Universal screeners are valid and reliable. When an assessment is valid, it is measuring what it is intended to measure. These screening measures serve as an indicator of a broader academic domain, such as fluent reading. And these assessments are reliable, which means there is a consistency of the measure and has inter-rater reliability. As well, these assessments are efficient. They are timed measures, usually for 1 minute. Screeners provide an indicator of risk. Implementing these early in kindergarten, grade 1 and 2 allows us to provide the early intervention for students who are demonstrating risk for reading difficulties based on data from screening measures. We often hear universal screeners being considered a temperature check. I can quickly check the temperature of all my students as an indicator of general health. Examples of universal screeners are measures provided by Acadience, Ames Web, and EasyCBM. Parker and colleagues did a study in 2015 to compare the diagnostic accuracy of benchmark assessments, specifically the Fontes and Pinnell, and the oral reading fluency measure, or ORF, which is a universal screener. In this study, they considered the diagnostic accuracy of ORF and reading inventory levels, or benchmark levels, for risk of reading difficulties. When looking at the benchmark assessments, they found that of the 279 students who scored below on the benchmark assessment, 90 actually had reading difficulty. Of the 567 scoring at or above, 200 actually had reading difficulty. This is concerning because we believe these students to be developing as expected, but really they would require additional support. Based on these results, these researchers determined that the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessments correctly identified students at risk for reading difficulties 54% of the time. If we consider the time it takes to administer these assessments for each individual student, we could essentially flip a coin to get the same degree of accuracy in identifying students at risk for reading difficulties and those who are not. Looking at the results from using the oral reading fluency, we see that of the 421 students demonstrating risk, 276 actually had reading difficulties. Of the 567 scoring at or above, 46 actually had reading difficulties. The correct classification percentage with the universal screening measure was 80%. This is a much higher rate of reliability than that of the benchmark assessment. We've discussed the difference between benchmark assessments and universal screeners, and now we will look at what these screeners measure, who we should be assessing, the information provided by these screeners, and how often it is recommended that we collect this data. Depending on the company, there will be some variance in what is included in the measurement suite, but they will all include a phonemic segmentation measure, a letter name fluency, nonsense word fluency, and oral reading fluency. Different assessments are administered to different grade levels at different times of the year to reflect the skills students should be developing at that time. Screeners administered in kindergarten and early grade 1 will assess specific skills that contribute to later reading development. You will notice that all measures include the word fluency, and that is because all measures are timed so that the data collected will reflect the accuracy and automaticity of that particular skill. First sound fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency measure aspects related to phonemic awareness. Letter name fluency measures are general indicators for risk. These are not letter name and sound assessments, so you are not getting information about which letter names and sounds a student knows based on the entire alphabet. You would need to do a different assessment for that information. Rather, this is more of a rapid naming task. The nonsense word fluency measure assesses the alphabetic principle and basic phonics. It can provide information on letter sound knowledge and early decoding of non-words with the vowel consonant and consonant vowel consonant letter patterns. A note here about this particular measure: there are often a couple teacher responses when administering this screener. First, teachers may be reluctant to trust data from this measure because it is using non-words. What we know is that more proficient readers will do better at this assessment because they understand the orthographic pattern. Weaker readers tend to look at the words and try to read it as a real word, even though you have provided the context in your instructions that these are not real words, and you have taken them through the sample words at the beginning of the assessment. So if students do not do well on this measure, it is not because they have not read these words before or because they are not real words. It is because they don't have a strong understanding of the basic phonics skills, or perhaps even more foundational, they don't have strong phonemic awareness or knowledge of all the letter sound correspondences. Secondly, a common instructional response to this measure is to begin incorporating nonsense words into instruction. The thought behind this is that if I teach using nonsense words, or at least include them with real words in my instruction, students will learn to read nonsense words and perform better on this measure. This is not something we want to do. We should be using real words in instruction because we want students to learn to read and recognize patterns in real words. The more skilled they become at learning to read real words, the more developed their orthographic knowledge becomes, the more proficient readers they will be. We don't want to use instructional time to teach them to read nonsense words when that time should be spent having them read with real words. For example, I don't need to teach the word MIP. Instead, I would be teaching students about the short I pattern with words like sip, tip, mit, and pit. And if students have a strong understanding of that orthographic pattern, they will be able to read the word MIP on a nonsense word assessment. A word reading fluency measure provides information on automatic word reading. These are with real words. Probably the most commonly known screener is the ORF, or oral reading fluency. This measures accurate and automatic word reading as well as reading comprehension. There are additional measures, including maze and silent reading fluency, that are introduced at higher grade levels. If you are implementing universal screening for students in grade 3 or higher, these are measures that can also be used. In 2001, Fuchs and colleagues conducted an analysis of oral reading fluency as an indicator of reading competence, which includes not only accurate and automatic word reading, but also understanding or comprehending what is being read. On the previous slide, it is noted that the oral reading fluency can be used to indicate comprehension. However, if you have administered an ORF, you know that you do not ask students comprehension questions at the end of their reading. This was a process we were used to doing when administering benchmark assessment. Remember that when we administer the ORF, students are only reading for 1 minute, so they are not expected to read the text in its entirety. Several studies have been conducted to clarify the relationship between oral reading and general reading proficiency, which includes comprehension. Reading aloud has been found to be a better indicator of reading comprehension than were other typical comprehension measures, like answering questions or engaging in a closed procedure. According to Nathan and Stanovich in 1991, there is no evidence that children decode words without extracting meaning. provided that the word meaning is already established in memory. What we know is that when students are able to approach word reading with accuracy and automaticity, that cognitive space is freed up for making sense or comprehending what they are reading. Therefore, proficiency in accuracy and automaticity has a high correlation to reading comprehension. Which students are we assessing with universal screeners? All students. These measures are used to identify risk. Information gathered from these assessments should be used to inform next steps regarding instruction and early intervention so that gaps can be remediated early and that difficulties won't persist to the point where the gap becomes so large it is not only difficult to intervene, but it will take much longer. And we know the damage that can do to children when they have struggled for a period of time. As well, when these screeners are used in kindergarten through grade 2, we are looking at early reading skills as well as text reading, and a significant amount of skill and reading development occurs over these years. We screen all students to ensure they are developing as would be expected. To screen all students, you will use the benchmark protocols within your assessment suite. All students are assessed on grade level materials because you want to know where each student is at in relation to their grade level general outcome. You are assessing current level of risk and the likelihood of achieving the next benchmark based on current grade level. It is highly recommended that screening take place 3 times per year to ensure students are making adequate progress. If it is only done at the beginning and middle of the year, we don't have information around where students have finished the year in relation to grade level expectations. If it is only done beginning and end of the year, teachers and data teams aren't able to make instructional decisions to respond to the needs of individual students at that midpoint of the year. And in these early years, we don't want to assume students who may be at benchmark at the beginning of the year will continue to make the progress necessary throughout the year to be where they should be by the end of the year. And finally, these screeners will tell us if students are responding to the core instruction provided, making the adequate progress necessary for reading proficiency. What is the information a universal screener will provide? These measures will identify which students are at risk for reading difficulties, and at the classroom level, they can inform around if that core Tier 1 instruction is effective. Teachers will use the data to make informed decisions about next step for students. No longer are they taking all of their level Bs and providing them with the same small group instruction that may not be addressing the different needs of those individual students within that group. Instead, teachers and data teams can look at this data and consider which aspects related to reading development may require more attention and additional instruction. They will also need to think about what additional information do they need in order to support these students. This overall reading composite score considers the scores of each measure that was administered to the student and provides an overall reading score. You can see here that overall, the first student is at benchmark, even though scores on 2 measures are below benchmark. The intensity of support and instruction necessary for this student to improve on their word reading automaticity and retelling may be different than the second or third student. When considering the needs of the second and third students, student 2 appears to be a slow but accurate reader. This student might be having to segment and blend many words in order to decode, and they are doing that successfully, but they need continued support in building up storage of those orthographic patterns for automatic retrieval. The third student requires some attention to both accurate and automatic word reading. Next steps for the teacher and/or data teams would be to think about what additional information needs to be collected, which students would create a small group based on similar needs, and then what will that intervention look like? Universal screening data will also inform around the health of a system. If we look at this data, we see that 76% of grade 1 students in this school do not meet the benchmark at the beginning of the year on the phoneme segmentation fluency task. If 76% of the students are not entering grade 1 with the minimum proficiency of this skill developed, they don't have that strong foundation to build on. Looking at this data as a school-based administrator or a board level leader, I would be working with the grade 1 teachers to support them in how they can accelerate the growth in this area while still moving forward and developing more advanced reading skills. I would also be working with the kindergarten teachers to find out what is needed there so that more students are developing this skill. This could be supporting them with coaching, resources, professional learning, modeling, collaborative time as a grade level team. I would be working with them to support them and finding out what it is they need to support instruction and student learning so that these students are prepared with this skill when they enter grade 1. If you have been implementing universal screeners, you may have experienced some of these things I will highlight. If you are in the initial stages of implementation, note that these are things that could come up as you are working to shift the assessment landscape in your school or board. One of the features of universal screeners are that they are efficient. Measures are timed for 1 minute, so we are moving away from having them read entire books and moving up and down levels where testing time can take 20 minutes or more per student. When we compare the administration time to previously used assessments, there is a significant decrease in time. However, in kindergarten through grade 2, we are administering several measures to each individual student because in these early stages of reading development, we need to ensure that they are developing those discrete skills that contribute to future word and text reading. As well, with some of the companies, you administer more than one oral reading fluency protocol and take the median scores, which takes longer. We need to remember that we are getting valid and reliable information, and in these critical years for reading development, this testing time for each individual student is well worth the investment of time. Another common sentiment heard from teachers is that they already know which students are struggling. This teacher understanding may be through the various instructional activities the students are engaged in, based on observational reading behaviors, or perhaps identified through the types of text students are reading. However, teacher observation or perceived knowledge of which students are developing proficiency and which are not can lead to decisions informed by bias. In efforts to decrease testing time, it is often asked by teachers and school-based administrators, why do we have to screen students who have already demonstrated they are at or above cut points for risk? If we screen students at the beginning of the year and don't screen students who scored at or above again until the end of the year, or maybe not at all again that entire year, we are making assumptions about the instruction provided and the degree to which the student is responding to that instruction. The benchmarks on the screening measures represent a moving target that students will be able to read more words correct with a higher degree of accuracy on grade level text by the end of the year. We want to have a system in place where we are ensuring all students are making progress toward that goal throughout the year. Let's look at this a little more closely. I will use Scarborough's reading rope to highlight the importance of early screening of all students 3 times per year. Scarborough's rope not only demonstrates the various skills in both language comprehension and word recognition that need to be developed for skilled reading. It also conceptualizes reading development over time if you are looking across the rope. Let's focus on the word recognition skills. Early on, we see that these skills, represented by the strands in the rope, as very isolated. As readers in kindergarten through grade 2, students are working to develop these skills quite independent of one another until they begin to become more proficient in each and can work to start integrating them to develop as readers. Over time, some say around grades 4 to 6, we see the strands within the word recognition and those within language comprehension more tightly woven, and that readers are able to become more skillful and automatic word readers and more strategic with their knowledge of aspects related to language comprehension and text comprehension. That will continue to develop over time as these readers work with more complex texts and various types of texts where these two processes are working together in a very tightly woven, integrated way. Let's talk about if it is necessary to rescreen a student mid-year if they are at benchmark at the beginning of the year using the row. If I've screened all my students in grade 6 at the beginning of the year, would it be necessary to rescreen students who were at or above benchmark at the mid-year point? Likely not. They are in grade 6. They've demonstrated that the automaticity and accuracy in reading grade level text is firmly in place, so I know that those word recognition strands are working well together. My instruction is focused on how to navigate complex text and continuing to develop and support students in the strategic use of those components we see in the language strands. When we look at the row and know that this illustrates development over time, by grade 6, these strands from word recognition and language comprehension are more tightly woven and working together. So it would not be necessary to rescreen those students if they are already at or above benchmark. But how is this different if the student is in grade 2? At this grade level, students are still developing mastery in these word recognition skills. At the beginning of grade 2, a student may be at benchmark, but there are still many advanced word recognition skills that the student will need to learn and develop throughout the year as they continue to work on building their automaticity and accuracy in word reading, developing those language comprehension skills, and working to integrate those in meaningful ways as they engage in increasingly more complex text. It would be important to rescreen all students in the middle of the year to ensure that they are all making adequate progress and no one falls through the cracks. To further illustrate this point, let's look at cut points. These scores represent the cut points for oral reading fluency at the beginning of the year in grade 2 and the end of the year in grade 2. For a student to be at benchmark, they need to read at least 52 words correct per minute with at least 90% of accuracy at the beginning of grade 2. If I have a student who read exactly that, 52 words correct per minute with 90% accuracy, they would be identified as at benchmark. If I don't screen this student again until the end of the year, I am assuming that they will be responding to the instruction provided and develop as a reader so that by the end of the year, they are reading at least 87 words correct per minute with 97% accuracy. You can see that they have to make significant growth over the year, and I am assuming that their trajectory as a reader will be moving towards this target when in fact, they could be plateauing as the skills become more advanced throughout the year. This particular student could fall through the cracks, and their needs as a reader may not be addressed timely if we don't screen them again until the end of the year. The first few years are learning years. Teachers need to learn how to administer the various measures. Students will become more familiar with the assessment procedures. Efficiency will improve as those administering the measures gain confidence and practice with test administration. My advice is don't be too quick to make decisions based on efficiency when the capacity of those administering the assessments hasn't been built up yet. Looking at this example, this teacher administered the oral reading fluency to their grade 6 students. Instead of entering the median score from the 3 protocols, they added the scores together, which has substantially inflated the data. If the teacher looked at the actual cut points, they would know something is wrong with their data. So what is the consequence here if the teacher uses their incorrect data to decide which students they reassess and which they don't? Lastly, for those who have been collecting reading data either at the school or board level, or even for teachers at the classroom level, I want to share what might be expected when moving from benchmark assessments like Fontes and Pinnell, DRA, or PM benchmarks to universal screening measures. Here you can see the data from a school board for students in grades 1, 2, and 3. We don't have data from 2019-2020 because of COVID, and we do see a bit of a decline in proficiency that following year, but this data reflects a fairly consistent representation of the reading proficiency of students in these grade levels from over several years, even preceding 2018, 2019, even though those numbers aren't included in this chart. This data was based on using the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessments. In the 2022-23 school year, this board shifted away from Fontes and Pinnell to using universal screening measures. Recall how research has identified that the diagnostic reliability of Fontes and Pinnell is low and that universal screeners are valid, reliable assessments. Here is the data based on the universal screening measures for these grade levels. This is not a reflection of the students, but rather a more accurate representation of the reading health of this system. The point here is that when you implement universal screeners and collect that data, you might be alarmed at the data you see. But now there is transparency, and you are able to make informed, data-based decisions to support teachers and students to ensure that these scores improve, and more importantly, what that means for the reading development of the students you serve. This session focused on universal screening used to identify students at risk. In the next session, we will look closer at diagnostic assessments and how they are used to determine the individual needs of students.